tomorrow.
Have to come to Kenya.
You should.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think we'd like to get started. I want to urge you to continue to enjoy lunch. But we do want to start the program. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jeff DeBelco. I direct the Environmental Change and Security Program here. And we're thrilled to have you all come for today's session that we've entitled Understanding the Global Water Crisis, Insights from the Global Environmental Change and Human Security Network. We've been very fortunate here the last 3 days to have a very distinguished group of international visitors at the center holding their scientific committee meeting. This is the Global Environmental Change and Human Security Project, which is a core project of the International Human Dimensions Program on Global Environmental Change. It's quite a mouthful, but it's actually quite a distinguished group. So it's a thrill from our perspective to have hosted them here for a couple days. And we wanted to, in some ways, take advantage of their presence by having just a couple of them. And we could have had a number of different seminars, but in part because the Environmental Change and Security Project, through our Navigating Peace Water initiative, has spent a lot of time on international water issues. So we wanted to take advantage of some of three of the people, and there are even more in the group that are working on water, but three of the people who've really spent a lot of time looking at water issues. They're Ken Conca, who is here, actually the only one who is local, who is a professor in the Government and Politics Department at the University of Maryland. Ken's going to kick off, and I know floating around here somewhere, and I was going to wave it around, is a copy of his new book, Governing Water, that has won a couple distinguished awards. There we go. Thank you, Charlie. And he's going to talk about some of the institutions around water in various contexts. And so we look forward to Ken's remarks. Lila Mehta is coming to us from the Institute for Development Studies at the University of Sussex. She's a research fellow there and has spent a lot of time, including, and I unfortunately don't have the copy of her book, I have it at home to wave around, but focusing a lot on water and poverty, water and development, particularly looking at notions of scarcity and questions around rights to water. And so we're looking forward to her comments. And then it's a quick homecoming for Patricia Cameron-Bote, who just a month ago finished up a 4-month fellowship at the Wilson Center with our Africa program. It's terrific. Howard Wolpe, our Africa program director, can join us, and Steve and some of the colleagues from that program. We were thrilled to have Patricia here. She's coming from the Faculty of Law at the University of Nairobi, where she wears, in fact, many hats. Well, one today, but many hats. She's a lawyer, but she's also, among other things, has been, until just recently, the chair of the Nile Discourse Group, which is a civil society analog to the Nile Basin Initiative. And so she's going to talk about transboundary water management structures with particular reference to the Horn of Africa and the kind of civil society versus official negotiations and some of the interesting dynamics around that. I should also say, although it's not environment or water related, Patricia is a member of a 15-member commission appointed by President Kibaki to help try to sort out the constitutional crisis in Kenya. And they're about to deliver their report here in a couple weeks. So look for some headlines in early June. And you know that Patricia is part of making those headlines. As I said, we're thrilled that the GECHS folks are here. I think what I would like to do very quickly is go around the room and have everyone introduce themselves in part and ask those people to flag themselves as GECHS SSC members. And then we'll turn the floor over to Ken. Just one final word about the Wilson Center. A few of you are new to the center. I don't think I need to make this a long introduction. The Wilson Center is a former memorial to President Wilson, a living memorial where scholars and politicians come together for mutual exchange and dialogue. The Environmental Change and Security Project is a 12-year-old program that tries to do that in the areas of environment, development, population health, in the broader foreign policy and security policy context. We've had a special focus on water. I hope you will pick up some of our materials. There's a note on water stories where there are a number of working papers and even some multimedia on our website. We hope you will take advantage of that, and there's more of that to come. I should say that both Ken and Patricia are part of that Navigating Peace Water initiative as well. So, Lynn, can I ask you to be a first and quick introduction?
Sure. My name is Lynn Rosentrader, and I'm the Executive Officer of the GECHS project based at the University of Oslo, Norway.
I'm Karen O'Brien. I'm chair of the GECHS project, and I'm also from the University of Oslo.
I'm Owen Mann. I'm chair of the Scientific Director of the International Human Dimensions Program, of which the GECHS project is one.
I'm Kirsten Husser. I'm the project assistant at the GECHS
My name is Hans Bohle. I'm from the University of Bonn in Germany.
My name is Olga Tsipilova. I am from Russia. I am a fellow of Galina Starovoitova program at the Kennan Institute. I work as an environmental sociologist at the Russian Academy of Science.
My name is James McGlinchey. I'm an advisor to the Luso-American Foundation based in Lisbon. I reside in Virginia.
Steve McDonald. I'm a consulting project manager for the African Leadership Programs here at the Woodrow Wilson Center.
My name is Ajuadan Mutan, and I'm a consultant manager of the Congressional Staff Forum on Africa.
Eileen Bernardi with the Institute of Multi-Track Diplomacy here in Washington.
Linda Mensa of the same institute.
Natalie Jackson, the program assistant in the Africa program.
Richard Matthew. I'm a professor at the University of California, where I direct a research center, and I'm also on the GECHS Science Committee.
Janice Hogues with the Center for Global Development.
Lawrence Freeman. I work at the African desk of Executive Intelligence Review magazine.
Reverend Alfred Bailey. I am a representative of the Faith for Africa Project based in Dallas, Texas, and Baltimore, Maryland, as well as representing IUCN today.
I'm John Barnett, from Research Fellow at the University of Melbourne. I'm also a GECHS Scientific Steering Committee member.
Gene Foley, Foley & Associates, Washington, D.C.
I'm Nadia Saad. I'm retired from the World Bank. I used to be the regional representative of UNEP in Beirut, and I worked on water. I go every year to Egypt and lecture on the Nile project and on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on water.
Howard Walpley. I direct the Africa program, and the Leadership Project here.
Heather McRae. I'm in the Institutions and Governance program at the World Resources Institute.
Tracy Farrell, Programs and Sciences at Conservation International here in D.C.
I'm Reiko Ishiguro from IUCN. I'm intern.
William Coyne. I'm also an intern at IUCN.
Sas Harkopal, also from IUCN.
Charlie Chester from the Fletcher School, and I'm getting involved with GECHS in an upcoming conference.
Hi, I'm Andra Tambura. I'm an environmental consultant. I'm currently doing some work with the Clinton Foundation.
Hi, I'm Allison Berland. I've been a consultant at the World Bank for the last couple of years working on the Nile Basin Initiative.
I'm Yelena Nikitsina from Russia, Director of Eco-Policy Research and Consulting, and I am involved in GECHS activities.
I'm Jessica Roach, and I work at the Water for All campaign at Food and Water Watch.
My name's Gib Clark. I work here at the Woodrow Wilson Center with the Environmental Change and Security Program.
Hi, I'm Victoria Kaplan. I also work at the Water for All campaign at Food and Water Watch.
Hi, Megan Parker, also here with ECSP at the Wilson Center.
Allison Williams, also with ECSP at the Wilson Center.
Hi, I'm Paul Glick. I'm a research assistant for Patricia.
I'm Skip Kaufman. I'm at the International START Secretariat.
Finally, I'm Hassan Virji, the Deputy Director of International START Secretariat, which is the other part of the SEM Global Change family as GECHS.
Great. And I think I saw Ruth Greenspan now come in from RFF. Great, terrific. So Ken, why don't we turn the floor to you?
Great, thanks. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'll be fairly brief because Jeff has twisted my arm to come back down on June 15th and talk about my book, and I don't ever like to give the same talk twice if I can avoid it. So I'm going to pull a small slice out of some of the water work that I've been doing and focus particularly on the question of water and human security and some of the institutional challenges, I think, that relate to that. There are many working definitions of human security. When I think about human security, I think about the ability of people to meet their needs, exercise their rights, and live in ways that are consistent with their values and identities in their daily life. And if we think about the connections between water and that way of thinking about human security, it becomes apparent that rather than having a single-dimensional global water crisis, what we really have is a linked set of very difficult water challenges. The most immediate and obvious one from a human security vantage point is a set of numbers that are as well known as they are discouraging, that there are more than 1 billion people that don't have adequate access to a safe supply of drinking water, that there are more than 2 billion people that don't have adequate access, again, largely for reasons related to water, to healthful sanitation systems. As Peter Glick of the Pacific Institute is fond of pointing out, there are more than 2 billion people on the planet for whom the introduction of a sanitation system of the sort that was introduced at the height of the Roman Empire would be a significant improvement in their personal and public health and in the quality of their daily lives. And we should all reflect on that number for a moment. So it's quite clear that front and center in the human security questions around water is adequate access to water for basic human needs. It's important to note that, as with so many global inequalities, that problem is not evenly distributed. It falls disproportionately on women. It falls disproportionately on the young. It falls disproportionately on rural peoples. It falls obviously disproportionately on the poor. And it often, in many places, falls disproportionately on religious and ethnic and other forms of social minority groups. So that's front and center. At the same time that we face that as a global water challenge to human security, we also face, at the same time, the need to reverse the devastating toll that we're having on freshwater ecosystems. Again, some of the numbers are well known and some of the numbers are quite discouraging. Environmental economists who attempt to tote up the value of critical ecosystems for human health and well-being have generally reached the conclusion that, along with tropical rainforests and coastal ecosystems, freshwater ecosystems are among the most valuable. Again, in a narrowly human-centered perspective, they only account for about 1% to 2% of the land surface of the Earth, but they're disproportionately important to our well-being. The world's rivers are extraordinarily fragmented by dams, canals, and other forms of water infrastructure projects, taking a great environmental toll. 1/3 of all of the world's fish species are endangered, and disproportionately those are freshwater species rather than ocean species. The alarming rate of the loss of global wetlands, again, one could walk through an entire set of global statistics that in some ways don't tell us that much, because the problem often touches down in very locally contextualized ways, and as I'm going to suggest, it's very critically important to contextualize that. But this is also an element of human insecurity. I mean, Hurricane Katrina gave us a very clear illustration of that. Some very misconceived and misguided water infrastructure projects created conduits for the force of the storm to penetrate into the city of New Orleans much more directly than it otherwise would have. And of course, decades of the toll on freshwater ecosystems around the city, wetlands in particular, damaged the ability of the larger system to absorb the surplus water. And both of those were directly implicated in the toll that Katrina took on the city of New Orleans and the surrounding areas. So we need to find ways to meet people's basic water needs, and at the same time we need to find ways to reverse the toll on critical freshwater ecosystems. Another strand of this, of the global water crisis that we could connect to human security is the problem of allocating water across different sectoral uses. If you look at UN forecasts for the next 20 or 30 years, go to the UN Industrial Organization and look at their projection for industrial uses of water in the next 3 decades. And they'll tell you, there's a lot of uncertainty in the forecast, but they'll tell you that water use is going to increase by 50 to 100% over that period. Go to the Food and Agriculture Organization and ask, well, what's the additional need for agricultural water supplies going to be to feed hungry and growing world populations? And they'll tell you roughly the same thing, 50 to 100% increase. So the problem is, when we look at agriculture, when we look at industry, now, go to the habitat process within the UN and look at forecasts for what municipalities are going to need for drinking water and sanitation systems and other municipal uses of water. And again, you'll get roughly the same answer. Well, this is evidence that people in Habitat, people in UNIDO, and people in FAO are not talking to each other, because we're already using almost half of the available portion of the humanly accessible under current technologies portion of the global water cycle. So by definition, we won't be doing that. Now, I think it's a mistake to cast global water challenges primarily in terms of some physical endowment of water and some material problem of scarcity because of the inevitability of growing populations and thirsty cities and thirsty industries. And I know Lila's going to say a little bit about, is scarcity really the right framework for thinking about water challenges and water responses? And I won't go off on that. I'm not sure that that's the right way to think about it. But certainly it does raise questions for us about how do we allocate water supplies across different kinds of human needs, across different kinds of interests. Do we use price-based mechanisms, which economists would suggest would give us efficient underpinnings? Do we try to marketize water and treat it as a commodity that should flow to its highest value uses? Well, perhaps there are efficiency gains to be had there, but we also know there are enormous social controversies around that, and we know that there are great difficulties in making those idealized kinds of allocation systems work. Do we use political and administrative kinds of mechanisms? So there's a whole set of questions about water allocation that really underneath it are questions about what is water? Is it a commodity? Is it a human right? Whose water is it? Who should have voice in those kinds of allocation questions? So this is all by way of saying that the challenge of making us more secure around our water supplies is really several multiple interlinked challenges. These challenges play out on a lot of different levels, from the level of local communities to the level of international diplomacy in shared river basins to the level of global dialogues about water governance, about water funding, about water diplomacy. And one of the things that we can observe is that they strain our existing institutional arrangements, which were not established with these challenges centrally in mind. If we look at one of the institutions that's being thusly strained is international law. If we look at shared river basins, right? The best GIS data tells us there's something on the order of 263 rivers that either form or cross borders between countries. Well, only about 1 in 5 of those basins has any kind of treaty instrument in place between but at least a couple of the countries, never mind all of the countries in the basin, 2 or more of the countries in the basin. The UN spent about 20 years hammering out a global framework convention that should guide river basin governance. And after 20 years of discussion, it got into the General Assembly, and after another 6 or 7 years of discussion, it was voted out. Hasn't been ratified by hardly any countries and has not entered into force. And when you look, as we've done actually a data study that's coming out next month at the University of Maryland, on the actual content of those the agreements that govern those 1 out of 5 basins, you often find that they're little more than mechanisms to allocate amounts of water between countries, and they really don't incorporate some of what we now would consider to be best practices with regard to information sharing, prior notification, environmental protection, participation, peaceful dispute resolution. And so we can see ways in which international law has really been strained by the global water challenges. Another place where we've seen this strain is clearly in foreign aid and development assistance programs, which, frankly speaking, have not made enough of a dent in some of those statistics about water deprivation that I ran through at the beginning, and just as frankly speaking, sometimes have made a very big dent in the health of freshwater ecosystems and in the livelihoods of local communities because of misguided, ill-conceived schemes to solve water problems by enhancing bulk water supplies, often with very poor understanding of local water and society contexts. We can also see these challenges emerging in another institution for governing water, which is expert networks that have really consolidated globally in the last 10 or 20 years around water management. I mean, there's this whole series of journals and conferences and reports and statements about best practices, and the notion of integrated water resources management in the last 20 years has gone from being a gleam in the eye of some people who were thinking about water problems at a very early point in time to being, in some sense, almost the only language in which you can now conduct international conversations about water. It has become the dominant way of thinking. And in some ways, that's very good, because IWRM is about managing water at multiple levels and multiple parties and multiple uses. It's a broader and more integrated way of thinking about water than previous ways of thinking about it. But one of the ways in which we've seen the expert water networks community, which includes several people in this room, straining in the face of these challenges of water and human security, is that it has been difficult to figure out how do we bring the politics of water, how do we bring the social conflicts around water into those IWRM conversations. That in other words, IWRM it can't just mean good resource management practices, it can't mean efficient water allocation mechanisms, better water science of water resources management. It also has to mean conflict resolution. It has to mean community participation. It has to mean stakeholder dialogue. And people who work in these IWRM networks have been struggling to try to give that meaning as well. So one of the messages that I would leave you with is that we see the inadequacy of several of our existing institutional channels for governing water at all different levels. The other message that I would leave you with is that we're starting to see the emergence of new institutional channels for governing water, directly connected to the inadequacy of those existing channels. One of the things that I've done a lot with in my work, and that is discussed in my book, I won't really get into it here, is social conflict around water. And the way that what might be localized conflicts around water has increasingly been transnationalized and globalized. I attended the World Water Forum, the Second World Water Forum in The Hague in the year 2000, and Ismail Serageldin, who at that time was the Vice President of the World Bank for Sustainable Development, stood up at the NGO Forum, which was a very contentious event and moment at that place at that time. And he said, there are two social controversies that must be resolved if we're going to make any progress on global water challenges. One is the controversy around water infrastructure, and in particular the large dams controversy. And the second controversy is around pricing, privatization, and allocation mechanisms. And I think that statement was exactly right. And I think that the 6 years since that, and the third and the fourth World Water Forum, and everything else that's going on, really bears that out. And one of the things that we have seen around both of those controversies, which on one level are really controversies between a water developmentally minded state and portions of its population that might suffer from some of the development choices the state might make or some of the pricing and allocation choices the state might make. We've seen those controversies be dragged into the global arena. They are no longer local matters. Dam building was always a transnationalized enterprise because the money and the expertise. Well, now dam opposition is also a transnationalized enterprise because of human rights organizations, because of environmental organizations, because of indigenous peoples movements, because of networks, because of the anti-globalization movement, the alter globalization movement, and so on and so forth. The same is true with water pricing controversies. We know that much of the pressures for marketization of water, for commodification of water, for privatization of water services has come out of pressures for neoliberal structural adjustment. Well, the opposition to those practices is also increasingly played out in transnational and even global stages as well. So what we have is a situation where, because of the inadequacies of our mechanisms of international law, development assistance, and water-based expertise, to deal with these social controversies, we're seeing new kinds of social arrangements, thoroughly transnationalized, and even reaching a global scale of discussion, start to emerge and to congeal. And I actually think that's a very healthy and a very important and a very positive thing that we need to try to nurture and we need to try to build upon. So in the water infrastructure controversy, we saw the emergence of the World Commission on Dams. In some ways, a very conflictual enterprise where the people who felt that the only good dam was a breached dam sat down with dam builders, whether it would be, engineering experts or some of the big dam building companies, and tried to hammer out a shared understanding of what the past experience had been and perhaps what the rules of the road could be for the future. And we've seen it's a little more diffuse, but in the water pricing and marketization controversy, we've seen a broadly similar stakeholder dialogue start to emerge with some of the discussions around private sector participation. And I think there are some very important lessons from these. I would not want to romanticize what has been accomplished by these dialogues. The domain name for the World Commission on Dams actually expired last week. So if you go to dams.org, it's not there anymore, but they put themselves out of business, which perhaps is one of the lessons of what we need to do. We don't necessarily need a big new bureaucratic infrastructure. But nonetheless, I think there are some important lessons for both existing institutions and for the need for new institutions from this process, at least as I've been observing. One is that we got to stop thinking about water simply as a natural resource endowment, a commodity that has scarcity of value and therefore needs to be allocated across competing uses. That is certainly true. But water, at the same time that it is that sort of commodity, it's also a critical constituent of freshwater ecosystems. And it's also the anchor of local livelihoods and cultures in places all around the world. Anyone who's grown up near a river knows that intuitively. We need to recognize those meanings of water as well as the commodity meaning of water in our discussions about managing water. A second lesson, we have to take a broader view of who should have an authoritative voice in these conversations. There's a form of authority that comes from expertise. There's a form of authority that comes from representing the public interest. There's a form of authority that comes from representing a compelling moral or ethical claim. And there's a form of authority that comes from being able to put 10,000 people in the street and disrupt politics as usual if your voice and your concerns are not heard. It's important that we have somewhat more open institutional forms that make space for those voices. A third lesson, that seems to me, is that we need to take a wider view of rights. Rights are not just individual. There are important ways in which both of these controversies show us that community rights matter, identity-based rights matter, collective forms of rights as well as individual rights matter. And of course, rights are not just property rights, rights are also human rights. And a final lesson would be that we should recognize conflict for what it is. We should put the inherent social conflicts that come from the water challenges we face at the center of our institutional design. And that rather than trying to paper over conflicts with least common denominator statements of positions, or to marginalize those inconvenient voices that don't share the core understandings of existing institutions, we need to be much more in our institutional design about process, about dialogue, and therefore about social conflicts so that we can start to find some more robust solutions. Let me stop at that point, and it's a lot that I've put on the table, but I'll turn it over, I guess, to Patricia.
Thank you. Taking from where Ken has left, excuse me, my voice is a bit hoarse. I have a very bad flu, but I think I'll get through this. Basically, looking at a shared water basin and how the shared waters of the Nile can be used for the human security of people in that region. And basically, I start from the point at which you're looking at different states with different people. You're looking at different states with different interests as per their national needs. But within the nation states, you also have different groups of people. And it is the people that Ken was talking about having different rights. If you're talking about communities, if you're talking about individuals, all of them have different interests in water. And basically, there is the sense in which fierce competition over these water resources can be a source of conflict. This has been the view of the UN Secretary General. And one looks at the way in which you could use water not as a basis for conflict, but as a basis for peace. And essentially, in looking at water as a basis for peace, you're looking at how you mediate different needs and different values and different rights of both countries and individuals and communities. And I think this is basically what the Nile Basin Initiative has sought to do. The Nile Basin covers 10 countries, starting all the way north in Egypt and going down to the Democratic Republic of Congo. And basically, you're talking about an area covering about 3 million square kilometers, 160 million people. And you're also talking about an area where you have a high rate of population growth, you have the population growing, and therefore when you talk about human security, you're talking about the need to meet more food needs of a bigger group and more water needs of a bigger group, as well as growing economies. And it is within this context that the countries in the region, the 10 countries, came together and began to negotiate what is now known as the Nile Basin Initiative. And talking about the Nile Basin Initiative coming together in 1999 is simplifying the matter, because the kinds of suspicions that there were between the different countries actually made even talking at some point very difficult. Most of you will remember statements made by people like Boutros Ghali saying that there was going to be water wars, and the Nile was actually the focus. So essentially, what started out as cooperation around sharing of scientific information coalesced into what is now the Nile Basin Initiative, and you have the Basin Initiative countries coming together to work for the benefit of all the countries as well as the people of the Nile. And the countries have come up with a shared vision for the development of the Nile, which is to achieve social economic development through equitable utilization of and benefit from the common Nile Basin waters. And essentially, I think looking at equitable utilization, one needs to go back to the kinds of principles at the international level that govern management of water. Are we talking about equitable utilization, or are we talking about prior appropriation? And I think for the countries of the Nile, these two principles continue to be extremely difficult to reconcile, because if you talk about equitable utilization, you talk about the rights of all the basin countries. How do you deal with a situation where two countries, that is Sudan and Egypt, have had the bulk of the waters of the Nile? And essentially then how do you work together when you advert to the principle of prior appropriation whilst you're still concerned with having equitable use of the waters? So actually the countries have managed to develop a comprehensive program, and basically you have three organs that manage the Nile Basin Initiative. That's the Council of Ministers, made up of the Nile countries' water ministers, and the chairmanship or the chairpersonship of these rotates around the countries. Then there's the Technical Advisory Committee with 2 members from each country, and then there's the Secretariat, which is based in Entebbe, Uganda. And I don't know whether the choice of Entebbe was because that's where the Nile is said to have originated from. The Rwandese will tell you that it originates in Rwanda, and I think even the Congolese have a place where the Nile originated. The 2 programs under the Nile Basin are basically, the first one is the basin-wide one, the Shared Vision Program, and this covers all the riparian countries dealing with issues of regional power trade, water resources planning, confidence building, and stakeholder participation. And I think a lot of work now has been done around confidence building and stakeholder participation because of the need to get everybody to be on the same page in terms of what needs to be done. I think the kinds of concerns that Ken was talking about dams, are things that people in the region are concerned about. So when you begin to talk about power generation, people have been concerned about what is it that we mean by this and how is it going to impact on peoples along the basin. But we also have sub-basin projects, and these are divided into 2. There are those that deal with the Eastern Nile, and the Eastern Nile covers basically 4 countries, Egypt, Sudan, Eritrea, and Ethiopia. And then we have the Nile Equatorial Lake Subsidiary Action Program, which covers all the other countries. Basically, the projects, whether they are stakeholder initiative, confidence building, or the power trade, all of them are sought to actually reach the lowest appropriate level. And again, this is why a lot of time now is being spent on getting people to meet and discuss what the benefits are. They aim at poverty reduction, economic development, and reversal of environmental degradation. In fact, what the countries are doing as a collective is to identify what would be win-win opportunities. And you have countries coming together to work on water resource and watershed management. I think there is a project between Kenya and Tanzania looking at the Mara River. Then you have one between Uganda and Kenya and similar ones, basically looking also at environmental and natural resource management, food security issue, flood preparedness, and power and infrastructure. And essentially then, to talk about all those programs, as I was saying, without looking at where we are coming from, is simplifying it, because at the point at which the Nile Basin Initiative was being developed, it was developed at a very high political level. And in fact, you had governments coming together, and many times coming together not in the region, but outside of the region because of the suspicions. And the need was felt eventually for how do you bring people, because the water is not used by state capitals and by water ministers. How do you involve government, non-governmental groups, when you're talking about 160 million people who associate with the Nile and you have 10 ministers? How do you mediate the interests of the people? And essentially, again, looking at the agreements that I was talking about, there was an agreement in 1929 and another one in 1959, which allocated a lot of the waters of the Nile to Egypt and Sudan. And these are actually binding international legal agreements. And the question was, how do you deal with this? Because when the countries became independent, even though it was the colonial masters that had gotten into the arrangements, they were bound by the agreements. And the question is, how do the ministers then mediate the rights of people when people had already begun to say that these were inequitable? And essentially, again, looking at international law, not involving people. International law is state-centric. So what are the rights of the 160 million people to begin to question what the agreements that are really international agreements talking about? As I said, there was a recognized need to bring all the stakeholders on board. But I don't think that the ministers knew exactly how to do it. And I remember it was in 2001 when a group of non-governmental organizations, then I worked for an international non-governmental organization, and that was the African Center for Technology Studies, came together with WWF, IUCN, and a number of others in the region. And basically, we began to talk about the need to bring civil society voice into the Nile Basin Initiative. We didn't know where to start. Our first meeting was actually held in Geneva because we couldn't meet anywhere in the region. And we had to make sure that the Ethiopian and the Egyptian didn't sit together. But we actually got some discussion going and came up with one statement, which we negotiated to be allowed to make at the meeting of the ministers and the funders in 2001. And in that statement, we actually made a very clear case for the need to bring the other people, to bring civil society, to bring women's groups, to bring the people of the Nile to the discussion on how the Nile was going to be developed. And again, this wasn't easy. There was a lot of suspicion, even as we got invited, the group got invited into the meetings that came later. You would always be asked the question, who do you represent? And being an international non-governmental organization, one sometimes struggled to say who they represented. How are you a person of the Nile when you live in Nairobi and not in Kisumu if you're from Kenya, or you live in Kampala, not in Jinja, or Entebbe if you're Ugandan? But after all that, the case was made, and I think it was realized that we weren't going to go much further if there wasn't a discourse going. And we started a process then of having a parallel process, a Nile Basin discourse, bringing together more and more people. We realized that we couldn't claim to represent the 160 million people. So it was necessary to begin in each of the countries to develop a basin discourse. And the aim of these discourses was actually to find out who it was that needed to know what was happening and to get these people to bring their voices to what the governments were doing, and also facilitate the interaction between basin people, not just within one country, but between the Nile countries, as well as capture the voices of the poor at national and subnational and local levels. People that were mainly concerned not about whether Egypt had more water than Kenya or Uganda, but were more concerned about alleviating poverty, food security, human rights, as well as the threats posed to their human security by environmental degradation associated with diminished water resources. the expectation here was that the participation of more stakeholders would contribute to the effectiveness of the Nile Basin Initiative, because if you had it developing at the top level, there was always the odd chance that people would then disown it and say that that is not something that they were associated with. And the need also to bring people to the negotiating table so that whatever was being worked on brought on board what were the genuine concerns of the people. And essentially, as I speak now, we have Nile Basin discourse dialogues developed in 9 of the 10 countries. And as Jeff said, I chaired the Kenya one until last year. And I think now it's come of age. And many of the people that started the dialogue feel that we can actually let the more local groups look to what is happening there and have an international group that sort of brings the voice to the international levels when that is deemed necessary. So what lessons did we learn? One, we learned the lesson that cooperation of water resources is possible, even in regions where you have conflicts rife, as is the case in this region, or where they are very likely, as they were when people were discussing going it unilaterally over the development of the Nile before this whole process started. And I think there is need to capitalize on what would be the peace dividends from that kind of transboundary water resource, such as the Nile. The second lesson we learned is that stakeholder involvement and participation is critical to enhancing broad ownership and ensuring that processes are inclusive. And I think the governments have begun to see that having civil society there is actually giving them a lot more credibility, because when they actually go to the local levels, they have friends rather than foes who meet them and discuss the issues relating to the Nile. And the third lesson is the need to invest in building cohesive communities through addressing broad human security issues. So rather than just talk about sharing of the waters of the Nile or appropriation of the waters of the Nile at the national level, if you bring in cohesive communities who are basin communities and who utilize the water, then you have a greater chance of dealing with the broader human security issues. And then basically, fourthly, moving from diplomacy to participation in shared river basins is actually a political process. So you cannot actually just talk about involving people without moving certain political structures. And moving from discussions between ministers to discussions between people involves actually diverse structures which which actually call on norms that are not necessarily international or national, but could actually be local norms and values. And then finally, we learned that substantive rights to access water are as critical as procedural rights. So it is as important to know that you have a right to access water as it is to be involved in the process that leads to accessing that water. Essentially, the whole issue of having access to information about what's happening in the basin was critical. The whole issue of feeling that you had access to justice, if you had a grievance, you had a way of getting that dealt with. And I think that's the issue that Ken was talking about, the dispute resolution mechanism. And then the need for people to participate and also to be able to come together and discuss issues related to a basin that they deem critical to their human well-being. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I hope you have energy for another presentation after these two very rich presentations. I'm very delighted to be here. Thank you, Jeff, for hosting us and also for organizing this very interesting meeting. I'm going to talk to you today about scarcity, water scarcity, and water scarcity is made out to be one of the key issues that accounts for the global water crisis, or so-called crisis. If you have a look at the representation that I have up there, what do those two dots stand for? Can you imagine? Can you throw out some ideas? Can you guess? The blue one is supposed to represent the amount of water that we humans actually have and can access, which is fresh water, because there's lots of water, but most of it is locked in oceans. and the pink one is air. So if you look at these representations, actually you would think, gosh, it's really dire and we don't really have much water at all. And there is really a scramble over scarce resources. And as Ken pointed out, there is a very dire situation that many, many people encounter, billions of people encounter across the globe. And all this has a very, very profound impact on human well-being and human security, as both my previous speakers have highlighted. But what does this obscure? What do images like this really obscure? And that's something that I want to talk about today. I want to talk about how scarcity has been portrayed in global policy debates, in national debates, and what this actually obscures in terms of policies and practice, and in terms of what actually happens on the ground. Now, the term scarcity is a very complex one. It's very polyvalent. It means very, very different things. But what I want to argue is that the way it's portrayed or the way it's problematized has a bearing on the solutions to water scarcity. And that, in turn, can sometimes exacerbate scarcity conditions that poor people, marginalized people encounter on the ground. I also want to argue that it's a very, very controversial phenomenon. It's not just a physical problem, but it's linked to, it has many, many connotations. It's linked to rainfall, it's hydrological, so people experience it in different ways, and that's what I'm going to highlight. It has agroecological connotations depending on soil content. That's how a local farmer may experience it. It's a socio-cultural phenomenon. It's economic, it's socio-political, etc. I want to argue that it's not natural. It's not a natural condition, even though actually it is made out to be something natural. And I want to trace that journey a little conceptually as well as in policy and practice. Because of this naturalization and the way it's been naturalized, in some ways we often have very problematic framings and solutions to scarcity, and that are often very distanced from local level perceptions of the problem, as well as local needs and things that really matter at the local level. So what I'm going to do now is run through a very brief conceptual journey, which is whistle-stop journey. It was very interesting if you look at the ancient Greeks and the way they spoke about water and diamonds. Water was considered to be useful and abundant, whereas diamonds were considered to be useless and rare. Well, today what we have is that water has become a commodity, as Ken has portrayed, and it is extremely scarce. And because of the fact that it was considered to be useful and abundant, there were all sorts of principles around it. For example, somebody like Aristotle would speak about the good and how something like water would be intrinsic to human flourishing, to human well-being, to human security. And one would not really have pricing mechanisms around it. Now, economists have been very, very concerned with scarcity, and some people would argue that scarcity is one of the key principles of modern economics. It is the raison d'etre of society and also the basis of government. People like Adam Smith have been concerned with scarcity, Marx, Keynes, etc. Everybody has been concerned with scarcity. And if you look at it theoretically and you study social and political thought, scarcity is often made out to be a permanent condition. It's ubiquitous. People like Alexander Xenos, who've studied the journey of scarcity, argue very powerfully that often people move from seeing scarcities, experiencing scarcities, which were time-bound phenomena, linked to climate, linked to rainfall patterns that were experienced by people, to something that suddenly became a permanent condition. And I'll highlight that a little later with some empirical material that I'll draw on from my own field research. People like Lionel Robbins defined economics as a science that studies human behavior as a relationship between ends and scarce means, which have alternative uses. So much so, this has become very mainstream in our thinking. We see scarce goods are considered to be economic goods, and water is a very, very good case in point. Though, of course, the declaration of water as an economic good is very, very controversial still, in part because of it sort of negates the multidimensional aspects of water, its embeddedness in local culture, society, and also this whole tussle between the notion of water as a human right versus water as a commodity, which Ken has already portrayed. Now, of course, the universalization of scarcity in economic and social thought has been challenged in several quarters. I don't really have time to go into it in tremendous detail. But people who have studied institutions have highlighted that there are institutional arrangements, institutions matter. You can kind of avoid this Hobbesian notion of anarchy where people compete around scarce resources, where conflict ensues, to actually look at institutions where people can manage their scarce resources. There's a lot of literature on that. People like Amartya Sen have highlighted, and if you apply his entitlement analysis to food, to water, you would basically argue that some people's lack of water does not mean that water is scarce. Instead, it would imply that certain parts of the population cannot gain access to water for a variety of reasons. It may be because water is too highly priced, because of social exclusion, because of the lack of infrastructure, etc. And finally, people who are concerned with socio-political perspectives around scarcity would look at competing meanings of scarcity, would try and juxtapose how scarcity is portrayed and meanings around it, and also highlight the socially generated processes of scarcity. So why is it that some people are denied access to things like water, food? So one would study socio-political processes and how they contribute to aggravating portrayals of, the problem of scarcity. Now let me run through some of the more conventional portrayals of water scarcity. Ken has already run through some of these, so I think I can just skip them, all about, the actual numbers, very graphic portrayals. But what I found when I did my research on studying global portrayals of scarcity is a lot of fuzziness in actually defining how we understand water scarcity and water crisis arising due to scarcity. So you either have portrayals of, the thousands dying or the billions that lack access, etc. Now, if we go back to Ismail Serageldin, who seems to have been mentioned a few times today, he's happily sitting in Egypt now in the Alexandria Library. For him, current waters, with the Vision 21 and a lot of the processes that were unleashed, there was lots of arguments, not so much about actual scarcity currently, but there was all this problem or the scare of scarcity and the problems for the future. So in some ways, drawing on neo-Malthusian discourses to talk about how future population growth would lead to generalized scarcity and water wars. And the general solutions are often pricing mechanisms, market discipline, etc. And as we've already heard, these are extremely controversial. Now, again, scarcity is used to justify a lot of very controversial measures around privatization, around cost recovery, and the market is seen to be the solution. You rarely actually have a more socially conscious sort of solution like rights or entitlements portrayed by players such as the World Bank. Instead, it's generally the market that usually comes to the fore. And I mean, that's a long debate that I don't really want to get into. But a lot about full cost pricing. Now, a lot of hydrologists and others who are concerned with the science of scarcity have talk about thresholds of stress and water scarcity. So, for example, there's generally a globally accepted understanding of scarcity that a lot of people adhere to. For example, if the per capita annual water requirement falls below 1,700 cubic meters, a country will experience periodic or regular water stress. A lot of Washington-based institutions and think tanks, such as IFPRI, WRI, have classified countries according to these criteria, and several criteria, looking at annual water requirement, looking at future projections of growth, of water demand, etc. Now, all this is fine, but what does this really conceal? One thing, what does all this really mean? And I think in part, most of these global definitions and portrayals, their starting point is physical and finite supplies. Many of them point to economic scarcity, where a country may have sufficient water supplies but actually lacks investment to create storage facilities. But a lot of these portrayals from all these institutions that I've highlighted actually fail to distinguish adequately between scarcity or limitedness of water in the hydrological cycle and the scarcity of access of the poor and marginalized due to the lack of water, its poor quality, or their exclusion due to prevailing social and power relations. And I think these are factors that are often very obscured in these volumetric portrayals or very aggregate portrayals of scarcity. And in most of these documents, and I did quite a thorough analysis of them for a project that's just ended, water scarcity is seen as something that's natural instead of something that is exacerbated as a result of socio-cultural processes. Now, Jeff encouraged me to put this up there. I didn't really want to do it. It's because there's no hard copy of the book. But let me just hone in on some research in Western India. Again, there's a dam story there because this is a desperately water scarce area in GECHS, which is in Gujarat in Western India, which is supposed to benefit from the dam. And I went out there and did some research to try and understand what scarcity means to local people and to try and contrast local understandings of scarcity with state portrayals of scarcity. And what I found was there was really this tension between scarcities that are experienced by local people in different ways. So you have herders who actually understand scarcity in a different way, have different coping mechanisms with scarcity, to dryland farmers who basically have developed different mechanisms and adaptation strategies to scarcity. You have very differential understandings and impacts of scarcity. So in a drought year, as this year, you have a dryland cultivator who's growing very drought-hardy resistant crops to deal with scarcity. And then you have fat cat irrigators who are drawing on a lot of the water resources in the village and growing sugarcane, which is in a drought-prone, which is in a complete arid area. And this is all happening in the worst drought, so-called drought of the century. You have social conflicts around water, which Ken has already portrayed, a lot of exclusion around water, a lot of caste dynamics, the way in which people are excluded, battles around the daily scramble for water around the water tanker, and a lot of indigenous knowledge around water too, and water scarcity. How can you actually get water out of the riverbed? Where can you get the best water? And in some ways, this water quality was much better than the tanker water quality that the state was providing every day. And that was the state intervention to basically mitigate scarcity, but it actually was not really solving the problem at all. So why does all this really matter? And why is it that we need to unpack and look quite critically at scarcity issues? What I wanted to argue, I can leave that, was that when I did these two pieces of research, one was more a global portrayal of scarcity and to understand scarcity debates in India and South Africa. I haven't had much time to talk about South Africa. And also a very empirical, ethnographic piece of research in a very dry, scarce area. So I've done scarcity research on these two projects. What I've often found is that globally as well as nationally, official definitions of scarcity draw on absolute population numbers and absolute quantities and talk very little about the politics of distribution. They negate the fact that scarcity is a very multifaceted and complicated, complex phenomenon. And most people would acknowledge that in passing, but in policy documents and interventions, they stick to a very simplified notion of scarcity. And why is this done? There are many, many reasons for it. In some ways, the manufacture of scarcity or the politicization of scarcity can suit the interests of very, very powerful actors. So in the case of Western India, it suited people who were promoting a very, very controversial dam, who wanted to justify the dam. In my research in Cape Town, I found that it was very easy to use scarcity as this meta-narrative. So you can blame geography rather than saying, actually, there's very, very bad water management in the city of Cape Town. Operation and maintenance is really bad, and we need to address some of those issues. We need to curb a lot of the bad water management practices in the city. So in some ways in Cape Town, in the Western Cape, geography was blamed and made out to generate scarcity, as opposed to highlighting the anthropogenic and the human-induced aspects of scarcity. The other thing is scarcity is a very convenient technical term. Now, those of you familiar with the debate on conflict and natural resources find that scarcity is this unchanging independent variable that is used everywhere. So you have scarcity, you have population growth, and then you have conflict, rather than seeing how scarcity is politicized, looking at the politics of distribution, etc. It helps justify certain solutions. So science and technology are often evoked as the solution, all kinds of technology, all kinds of interventions. However, technology is not neutral, and technology can be both the problem as well as the solution. And we see that with all the solutions that are being proposed, be it privatization models or infrastructure projects, etc. And finally, responses to scarcity are not neutral, but are also part of socio-political choices. And finally, the scare of scarcity can help colonize the future, also to justify interventions in the future. So, for example, we need biotechnology for the future to feed billions and billions who are going to be hungry. So to sum up now and to conclude, scarcity is not natural. It doesn't have much to do with how much water, how much food there is to go around. It has a lot to do with questions of access, with social relations, and with the politics of distribution. And this makes us, thus it is important to question what we understand by the water crisis. Is it a crisis of actually how much water there is that's going around, or is it a crisis of access and control to a very, very precious resource that means very, very different things to many people? A question of ownership, a question of rights, a question of social justice. Thanks.
Well, excuse me. Thank you all very much. You've given us a lot to chew on. I think we'll go directly to a discussion. I'd like to ask everyone to remind us who you are before you pose your question. And also, if you would use one of the microphones that we bring to you, because we are webcasting this and want to have the video archived, and we want to hear your question. So who would like to kick off the discussion?
Thank you. Thank you. Yours was good too.
My name is Nadia Saad. I'm retired from the World Bank. I have been working on the water for 20 years. I have two questions. Number one, as you know, in The Hague, at the meeting which you mentioned, there were scenarios prepared, and all the scenarios to the 2025 came to the conclusion that this region of arid or semi-arid, this geographical region, whatever measures will be taken, including technology, education, etc., there still will be facing a crisis. So it has something to do with natural, and what are the possible solutions? This was my first question. My second question is that, what to Mr. Conker, you talked about the fact that institutions are far behind, and this is very true. But there is one aspect of this institutional thing that is very far behind, which is water is not taught as a subject in universities. So the people who have been talking about this have a very, very difficult time getting together to really think. The engineers, the economists, in the World Bank, it took 10 years for people to understand that agriculture had to do something with water supply. There were two different divisions dealing with this. So the problem is that the effort that Mrs. Mesa is doing is very, very good, but how can we put together a course that could be taught in universities so that people don't waste so much time just getting to learn all these different aspects of water? Do you know of any university which has such a program? Thank you.
My preference is to take a couple questions and then give the panelists an opportunity to respond. So why don't we go here and then over here?
Hello. Lawrence Freeman from Executive Intelligence Review magazine. I think there is a water shortage, at least my understanding is that about 40% of the consumption of water comes from wells, aquifers, from the previous ice age, so that we're using up water that's underground all over the world, including the United States and the Central Plains aquifer. So that there is a water shortage, but I don't think we should consider it natural, because mankind can change it. And I think this is one of the maybe flaws of the environmentalist outlook, is that we're not animals, so why don't we create more water? And I think this brings up the question of desalinization as a means to do this, and also most clearly the most effective form of energy for desalinization would be nuclear energy. So we should be able to be building nuclear power plants all over the world, including the arid regions. But you know, there is a shortage. If you look at the Nile, which I've studied, Egypt and Sudan divided up about 55 to 18 billion cubic feet per country. I think if the Ethiopians put a twig in the Blue Nile, they'd be harassed. So what are you going to do about the Nile for future generations? You have to build the equivalent of a second Nile River. You have to desalinate water for that area of the world, Egypt most especially. So those are the kinds of solutions which I think mankind is capable of using his mind and his scientific capability. And that's the only way to overcome an apparent water shortage, which we can transform if we put our minds to it, so there isn't one. But right now, I think we are amiss in not taking up these science and technology questions.
My name's Sylvia Tognetti. I'm a consultant. I write the Flows Bulletin on Payments for Watershed Services for the International Institute for Environmental Development. And my question was about the Nile Basin. You talked about benefit sharing, and I was wondering what form you see that taking. I don't know if you've reached the point yet, but whether there's some form of compensation for between upstream and downstream, whether it be the form of payments or development assistance, and whether you see that playing a role in conflict resolution.
Split them up as you please in terms of responding.
Okay. Who wants to begin?
You go.
Okay, sure. I always have something to say. Very quickly, the point about education, university curricula, et cetera, it wasn't a question, it was a statement, and it was a well-made statement that I would be in total agreement with. There are some very good, I tend to know programs in the United States, although there are many programs around the world. There are some very good interdisciplinary master's programs in the United States in water resources management. University of Wisconsin has an excellent program. Tufts University, the 7 or so colleges, that really doesn't fit the problem. And as someone who's inside a university, many of us are inside universities, that's the daily battle that we're fighting, is to sort of reorganizing those lines. And so the best thing that those of you who are in the public sector can do is support us in those battles and fund our initiatives to create new curricula that are cross-disciplinary, global in perspective, et cetera, because there are many of us, I think, with a lot of powerful ideas about how we could do that. We are tilting against the traditional logic of universities. But if we can bring in funding, then the universities will let us do almost whatever we want in this dollar-scarce environment that many universities have. So it now is, I don't say that facetiously, now is a good moment to invest in, and there would have to be multi-university initiatives and across borders and so on, but there's a lot of opportunities to start doing this, so I'm glad you brought that up. On the point about desalinization and nukes and so on, I have a different perspective. I thought you were going to say solar was the obvious energy, rather, and we could talk about that afterwards and so on. There is a saying that you don't want to make a small problem smaller by making a big problem bigger. And I would say that littering the world with nuclear power plants in order to have a very high energy throughput to purifying water, when 70% of world water is used in agriculture and simple drip irrigation systems could find us the equivalent of the water that you'd get from a couple of hundred of those nuclear fuel desalination plants, might be the way to make a big problem smaller and maybe a small problem bigger, rather than a small problem smaller and a big problem dramatically bigger. There is a debate between the hard path and the soft path. I'm agnostic in some ways. I do think, I'm not someone who believes dams should never be constructed, that there's no role for centralized, capital-intensive approaches to water problems. They have to be contextualized. And in many of these contexts, I find that there's a lot of appeal to the soft path, because it's more decentralized, because it's more flexible, because it's more adjustable, and because it creates more space for the ideas about voice and participation that I was stressing. Desalinization is so energy intensive. It strikes me as it's sort of like nuclear fusion. It's one of those, glimmering technologies that's 20 years away and always will be in some sense. And there's a lot of talk today about biotech and sort of the next generation discussion. We're going to create crops that don't need any water, and we're going to go to virtual water and all of that. And I think those solutions do have their place, but they often strike me as sort of reproducing an old logic of water management that in social terms we now have to some extent transcended.
Okay.
I'll take the question on the Nile. There hasn't been discussions on compensation by lower riparians to the upper riparians yet. I think what's contemplated is more common development and seeking to get benefits from the initiatives that they start on now. I don't think there's any intention to deal with what are seen as historical injustices. The other thing that I've seen happen is Egypt actually investing quite a lot in some countries in the region to dig up wells. And that, of course, could also be controversial because if you're digging wells in a place where the underground aquifers are already depleted, then you may actually not be solving the problem. And this has actually come into sharp focus with the recent drought, the drought that ended in April. There was a big drought in the Horn of Africa region, and you had wells being dug. And I see this as a way of beginning to deal with what are seen as the tensions that occur when you have water scarcity and there is an injustice that has remained unaddressed for a long time. But with the Nile Basin Initiative, what it is dealing with issues from now on.
Okay, very quickly. I agree about course correction. I think one thing that this project GECHS could do would be to try and think of, ways in which to bring very interesting research and findings and, a community of scholars and practitioners together to come up with this kind of curriculum. Regarding the scenarios and the solutions, the area where I did my research would probably be categorized as this area that is doomed forever. On an average, it gets about 300 millimeters of rainfall a year. And I found that there are solutions, some of them, that are more locally appropriate. A lot of the yardsticks that people were using were around irrigated agriculture. Now, irrigated agriculture may not be the best option for a dry land. So in some ways, one needs to understand the dynamics of these dry lands, of semi-arid and arid conditions, and understand uncertainties and risks and things like that, and then come up with more appropriate solutions, I think. Like dryland agriculture. In this area, agropastoralism would have been very good, but the state completely neglected it, completely ignored it. I don't really want to go into a debate about nuclear energy. I think Ken has answered that very well. In fact, what you were saying, I think in some ways exemplifies what I was saying about technology as being the solution. Now, whatever you take, whether you take desalinization or nuclear or dams or whatever, all these things are portrayed as, magic bullet type of solutions, but they are always going to be contested. We have to find out whether they're locally appropriate or not. We have to have deliberation around them, decision-making processes, etc. But what you often have in the water management debate or scenarios is that, experts are called in, they come up with their solutions, and then you usually have this kind of contestation. So that kind of needs to be avoided. I wouldn't necessarily just always say that you have to always go to the small. Small is always beautiful. There's a lot of ugliness to smallness too. If you don't really look at social arrangements, if you don't pay attention to who's benefiting, there's going to be problems. So I think one needs to understand that technology is always going to be embedded and is going to be influenced by prevailing social and power relations.
There was one additional point on the scenarios that I think is really fascinating and important to make. The Global 2000 report, which was done in the 70s and published in 1980 and sponsored by Carter, disavowed by Reagan and so on, we decided it would be interesting in the year 2000 to go back and take a look at whether it hit the mark or not. And actually, one of my colleagues at the University of Maryland, Dennis Paragus, published a very interesting book on exactly that. And we went through water, and I did the water analysis. And if you read the qualitative portions of Global 2000, they were quite prescient. They knew that water was going to be a coming issue. They saw that there was going to be increasing social conflict. They understood the importance of freshwater ecosystems and environmental issues and so on. When you looked at the quantitative analysis, their scenario was that water use between 1970 and 2000 would approximately double, from 4,000 or so cubic kilometers per year to 8,000 or so. Think about a cubic kilometer of water for a moment, and then think about 8,000 of them. They badly, badly missed the mark. And in fact, if you look, Peter Glick has actually done this, if you look at forecasts and you plot them by the year in which they were done, the further away from 2000 they were, the more they missed high. And so the plot just sort of goes down, 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 down as you get close to the year 2000. Global water use in the year 2000 was not radically different from global water use in the year 1970. Now, why did they badly miss the mark? They missed the social, political, and economic variables. They modeled it as being driven by technological scenarios, population growth, macroeconomic global growth. They didn't look at institutional variables. They didn't look at the extent to which the world would close the water deprivation gap. They didn't have an understanding of pricing and demand responses in markets and so on. And as a result, those scenarios badly missed the mark. And I think that, that the difference between that old school version of scenario doing and what people tend to do today is to recognize that we have a lot more capacity to create futures, and that it's these key social arrangements. And so any good water scenario today will say, here's the business as usual scenario. If we don't alter social, political, and economic, here's the high efficiency scenario, here's the mid-range, and then they'll start to attach costs and key policy measures to get to creating which scenario we want. So I wouldn't dispute that scenario for that portion, except in the sense of it being inevitable.
Hi, Andra Tamburo, consultant. I'm doing some work with the Clinton Foundation right now on water and sanitation. My question is directed towards Ken. You were talking about integrated water resource management and how that the social and political issues it was kind of difficult to fold them into the whole IWRM model. My question for you is, do you see better models out there to get these issues into the foray, or do you think that IWRM just needs to be worked on a little more and the people working on it need to be more accepting of these issues?
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of different, and I think all of us would probably have a perspective on this, but just very briefly, there's a lot of different understandings of what IWRM. I mean, I think, as a general insight, IWRM is a very powerful way of looking at water, and that's one of the reasons why it's become so ubiquitous. It's like sustainability. It's a powerful insight, and we need to constantly sort of acknowledge that. But there's vagueness in IWRM. Some ways of putting into practice that which is called IWRM have very one-way notions of participation, where the government cannot implement its programs without being able to give society its marching orders. And so society feeds information into government, and then government feeds marching orders back out, and then it is society's job to take up and implement. And often, it was interesting, Patricia said that the governments in the Nile Basin, Jeff and Howard and I, some of the work we've done, and Patricia in the Okavango, we saw similar things. Governments realize they can't implement their projects without social participation. So they're invoking that notion of participation, but there's a danger that sometimes it could be a sort of a one-way flow of information. There are much more sort of open ways of thinking about participation. And so I don't think the problem lies in IWRM. I think it's sort of, making it tangible and concrete. There are problems with, it is true that as you increase the number and the heterogeneity of the participants, it is harder to get things done, to move product, to finish the reports and so on. And I would never deny that that's a problem. But again, I think there's a larger problem with, denying people voice, with not having the people in the room who can say, that's an appallingly bad idea, and you don't even recognize it because here's all the things you don't know. And so it depends on which of those you think is the larger problem. If you see it as we know exactly what to do and we just need to be able to get out there and implement, then maybe all of this stakeholder stuff is just going to gum up the efficiency of the machinery. But if you don't view the problem as that way, if you think we often don't know what to do in particular local contexts and we can only do it if we do it in solidarity with local communities, then you need to open the doors.
Barnett from the University of Melbourne, and I'm on the GECHS SSC. One of the things I think, I'll try and turn this into a question at the end, but I'll preface it with observations from 3 countries in the last 12 months where I've done research. the focus on water and the water problem seems to me to be exclusively about surface water and rivers. And yet in 3 places where I've worked in the last 12 months, it's water, or what the Chinese more accurately call underground water, that is often the critical issue. In the research we've done on the lower Yellow River, rising water tables and salinisation of water is in fact perhaps the most critical long-term problem they face, rather than water scarcity, which arises due to a system of allocation that gives them water, which farmers naturally use in the period where there's rainfall. So they over-irrigate and you get rising water tables. In Australia, the critical land use problem and water problem is dryland salinisation of soils. In atolls in the Pacific Island where I work, there is no surface water at all. They're entirely using underground water in the Chinese term. There are degrees of uncertainty about the extent of their water resources. In fact, in Tuvalu, in the capital Funafuti, they don't know how much water they have. They're pumping out their underground water, they have industrial development, they've got contamination of their water resources. In some islands, in droughts, they run out of water, they start drinking coconuts, rates of cholera go up. You know, and these are really, really critical issues. And it seems to be in the modelling and in the framing, in the discussion of integrated water resource management, in the institutional arrangements, are not at all equipped to deal with issues about groundwater and the sort of problems associated with that. Is that a fair criticism? That's the way of making the question.
Okay, I'm getting some more.
Sure, we can take a couple more, or we can throw that back to you. Why don't we take that one?
Yeah, I mean, the thing with groundwater is very interesting because it's very, very tricky. It's often linked with riparian law, so it goes hand in hand with land ownership. There's lots of problems around determining questions of ownership, and it's very easy to actually get away with appropriation and, really exploitation. So clearly in the area where I've done a lot of research, the groundwater level goes down by about 1 meter every year, and it's desperate. But again, people can overcome that. If you have the money, you have the financial clout, if you have the power, you just dig and dig and dig. And if you don't have that power, then you're not going to have any water in your well, but nobody's going to take you to account, and you get away with it. So in some ways, I think a lot of the groundwater crisis and the groundwater problem has a lot to do with also with legislation, with institutional mechanisms, etc. And I think in some ways the legal frameworks are ill-equipped to deal with them. A lot of it has to do also with taking people to task, like in the farmers and irrigators are very, very powerful lobby. In parts of India, you don't actually charge people for electricity. So in some ways, they can pump as much as they want. So unless you get some of those issues right and sort out the property rights and the murkiness of property rights and how they go around groundwater, it's going to be very difficult to address the groundwater issue.
The international discussion about water historically was driven by shared river basins. If you go back and you look at the Brundtland Commission report, for example, which was written in the 80s and published in 87, A, there's almost no discussion of water in it whatsoever, and B, that which did punch through onto their radar was the problem of avoiding conflict in shared river basins. And when we try to have global conversations about these things, it strikes me that we make 2 big mistakes. One is we tuck them into sort of a sovereign state model where unless things physically directly transcend that, they are local matters to be handled by local governments with international assistance at most, right? And I'm not here to, dismantle sovereignty. It's a time-honored institution, but we have to find ways to think across borders. Or we get into the one-size-fits-all. And your observation, I think, illustrates both of those problems in the global conversation. Its inability to differentiate locally and its tendency to only see things as international when they flow across borders. It's not just water that flows across borders. It's people, it's money, it's ideas. We got to get that part of it into the dialogue. I do think that's been happening, but it's a catch-up sort of exercise.
Yeah, I have a question for you. I agree that norms and standards and stuff like this often sort of represent themselves as technical, and it obscures the politics behind them, and it's good to include people and encourage stakeholder dialogue and to be sensitive to the local context. And I guess my own experience working with IUCN for quite a long time is that there's been a lot of genuine attempts to do this. I mean, you know,
Absolutely.
there are lots and lots of efforts to entertain different perspectives and so on. Now, one of the disconnects that I've seen is that a lot of the people who are sort of promoting this way of organizing those areas of the world that are especially poor and vulnerable don't themselves live that way. They don't have much sort of participation in the decisions about the water they're using or the energy they're using and so on. So there's a sort of image of the way the world should be organized. And then the people doing this research live a very different way. And I was wondering if you had any sort of comments on what the implications of this might be.
Do you want to go?
I'll say something.
I'll say
Go ahead.
something too. Go ahead.
I think what you're saying is right, that you have, and talking again from where I'm coming from, where participation isn't really the way in which people actually relate with governments. So it's really, and it's something new, and it's not even anchored in, if you look at the framework of rights that people have, it wouldn't be one of your first generation rights. It's something that you're sort of negotiating. The freedom of access to information. The information is not freely available. But what I see is that once you start developing along certain areas, the culture of participation, it actually grows. And even for people that would not have, for instance, taxed their city council on the way in which it manages the water, you have people organizing. So I see it as something that is growing, and that even though new, I mean, when you talk about access to information, the right to be involved, even in environmental law, that is something that is very new. I think it's only in the late 90s and 2000 that you even have an access to information convention. And that's a European convention that people are taking on. And you have an initiative now which people are talking about public involvement in environmental decision making, which would touch on decisions on water. So I do see it as something that's growing and that's going to continue to grow. And I think you're going to have it anchored more and more within the rights-based approaches to development.
Very quickly, I think participation, yeah, it's very easy for it to be a very glib word, and, you know, everybody talks about participation now. It's, you know, it's like one of those boxes to tick, like gender and things like, you know. So clearly, I think it can be abused a lot, and if something is really going to be participatory, I think it's going to be a very painful process. It's going to unleash conflict. There's going to be a lot of vested interest coming up. There's going to be lots and lots of negotiation that will have to take place. So what you're going to have is, you know, how do we sort out and how do we negotiate competing interests? So that's the first thing I want to say, and often that is neglected when one talks about, you know, let's have more voice, let's have more participation. The second thing, which you've also mentioned, I would totally agree with, is that you often need to exercise the right to participation to enjoy a whole host of rights and to have access to lots of these things. But it's not easy. People are not aware of their rights. There are mediators of social justice, and these people are the ones that ultimately represent people. There's problems of representation. So I think it's a long struggle. Look at South Africa. I mean, the most amazing constitution that awards people social and economic rights, the right to water, but lots of people are not aware about their right to water. They're not clamoring, they're not fighting, they're not mobilizing. I mean, we hear of these amazing cases in Joburg, but, you know, what about the millions in the Eastern Cape or wherever? So in some ways, you know, a lot of us researchers and academics also may have to be a little more realistic when we talk about these issues. It's going to be a long, long road, I think.
I drive a Prius, so please don't include me in that condemnation that you just offered. But seriously, I think, well, the fact that I drive a Prius illustrates something. I mean, we're all, to some extent, disempowered by these systems, but we're not all equally so. And those of us with some affluence and some resources can often make other sorts of adjustments in our lives to compensate for that. And I think one of the powerful things about the GECHS initiative and the human security framework is to recognize that differentiation, and that there are people who are, you know, at least as disempowered, but also lacking the adjustment capacity and living closer to the margin. And it's important not to, you know, lump it all together. I would also say that it cuts both ways. I mean, you're making an excellent point, but it is also the case that advocates of water marketization and water privatization overlook the inconvenient fact that almost nowhere in the United States is water privatized. It's a public good that is provided by the state through regulated public utilities. And that system actually works quite well in our context. And so the general point about people advocating solutions that they don't live is a powerful insight. It isn't simply people who are advocating for democratic participatory mechanisms who advocate solutions that they don't live.
Yeah, I'm Karen O'Brien from the University of Oslo, and I'm on the Global Environmental Change and Human Security Project Steering Committee. I thought it was really interesting how you brought out the social, political, and institutional aspects of current water problems and the challenges that lay ahead. But in terms of climate change, which is actually going to change patterns of precipitation and timing of precipitation, and a lot of these, the biophysical factors that people are accustomed to, I'm wondering how that actually feeds in with some of these institutional, does that throw in a new wrench into the whole situation in terms of cooperation in the Nile River Basin, in terms of farmers in India, in terms of institutional river basin management?
Yes, is the answer.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's very hard to know. Clearly, it'd be another one of those big missing variables. One of the problems is that I have to be very careful here. We know an awful lot about the climate problem, and I would be the last person to want to sit here and say we don't know enough to take aggressive action. We've seen how that argument gets used. And I don't want to be associated with that in any way. That being said, one of the real challenges that we face, and again, this is a place where the human security paradigm I think is critically important, is taking what we do know down to the level of people's lives and people's responses in their lives. I mean, we were having actually an interesting conversation this morning. There's a difference between doing climate scenarios for agriculture as a sector and doing climate scenarios for agriculturalists, who are human agents who will respond to the stresses that they face. And so the real challenge is to start, it's going to be bad. It's going to be worse in some places than others. A lot of old practices are going to be altered. It's incumbent, I think, on us as social scientists to try to start to get a handle on what are the menus of responses that are available to people, how are people likely to respond, and so on, and feed that back into the climate modeling exercises.
Just very quickly, I think what I was talking about, uncertain water supplies and things like living with uncertainty and scarcity, clearly climate change adds another dimension to it, a real unknown dimension. We're not sure about the extent, but for people who have been actually living with uncertainty in some of the areas where I've done research, in some ways they're not going to be able to distinguish, is this because of climate change or is this because of less rainfall? They're not, the causality of the uncertainty is not something that, and they're going to be responding anyway. So in some ways what's important is to understand local level responses to these risks and shocks and to build on them, not undermine them. And what you have is, I don't want to glorify this culture of uncertainty, but let's just face it, people have really lived with uncertainty, have adapted to them, and a lot of state strategies and interventions have undermined them. So we really need to understand local level adaptation processes and facilitate dialogues between local level knowledge systems around uncertainty and the more policy-driven ones, and state and science and scientists and Western knowledge. And I don't like that kind of dichotomy, but to try and understand how these different knowledges and adaptation systems can come together.
And I think basically, even looking at the Nile Basin, if you look at the way in which the people have come together, it's the water ministries. So if you're talking about climate change, it's going to probably be the environment ministry, which is probably not dealing with water. So there's that disconnection, which probably needs to be removed so that you have the interconnections between desertification, loss of biodiversity, and climate change.
I'm going to take the chance to ask a question as well, which is we are about a week away from the due date for the State Department to issue its new strategy around water and sanitation as per U.S. foreign assistance. And we saw last year a relatively unprecedented bipartisan effort to raise the profile of this issue with legislation that went through in remarkable speed and lack of contentiousness between parties that we see on just about every other issue environmentally related. The so-called former Senator Paul Simon Water for the Poor Act. First time, notably, that any U.S. domestic legislation has approvingly included a Millennium Development Goal target or timetable, so endorsing the 2015 reduction timetable. So if you were asked to prioritize some essential ingredients as to either what the U.S. is doing and should do more of, or what is not doing, or opportunities that it could play a constructive role in its foreign assistance and raising water and sanitation as issues in terms of priority of its foreign policy, where would you point, and where would you point to not do such activities? Where would it be counterproductive to be working?
I'm not going first, though.
Okay, I could answer this. I don't know much about the U.S. Spending on water and sanitation. So it's very interesting to hear this. It's great that the MDG has been endorsed. I think there's two levels I want to answer this question. The first thing is, well, if you follow the Water Supply and Sanitation Collaborative Council in terms of what money is required to meet the MDGs on water and sanitation, it comes to about 9 to 15 billion a year. It's really not much money compared with military spending, defense. I mean, how much do we spend wherever in Iraq? I mean, 9 days of military spending is what you need to actually meet the MDGs globally. So that's probably my first point that I'd like to make. Of course, money is not everything. You know, if we increase aid, it doesn't mean that everything's going to be fine. If you pump money into water and sanitation, there's all sorts of questions around the governance of water, and there's corruption. And it's not necessarily just corruption in the south, but it's companies, global water companies, etc. So clearly, you know, money's not everything, but money can count. And I would say, yeah, maybe, you know, think about where priorities are. It's a socio-political choice where money goes. And it's not just for the US, but it's even for governments in the south. I mean, one often comes up, you know, South Africa says we don't have enough money, we can't really pay to implement the right to water. But again, you know, where's the money going? Who's making the choices?
Okay. Yeah, again, you know, not to say that throwing money at it is the way to go, but if they're going to throw some money.
Don't hold your breath, but go ahead.
Rural public health programs would be one obvious place related to waterborne diseases, infant mortality, under 5 mortality. I mean, that to me is the huge one. Gender-sensitive programs that look at social differentiation inside of communities and you know, what happens when you drill a borehole or when you know, install local sanitation systems and so on. And there's so many different ways that communities are differentiated around that stuff. And we ignore, I mean, men and women experience water deprivation, water affluence in dramatically different ways in most places around the world. And I think a lot of development assistance programs are, you know, recognize that, but it's important to always keep that in mind. Microcredit, again, it's a controversial notion. Are you further indebting people and so on and so forth? But Lila said something earlier that I thought was very interesting, that small can be ugly. You know, if you're going to move to some sort of, you know, quote unquote appropriate technology that's very contextualized and so on, and it still requires people to have a couple $100 up front to participate, that can be just as exclusionary in a poor community as something that never even reaches the poor community. And so while whether it makes sense to ask people to take on debt or whether it's done in other sorts of ways, they sort of, you know, small ways of empowering people with capital such that they can participate in these systems is another critically important thing. I'd say all of those would be more important than a sort of a borehole approach.
Can I just add one thing? Sorry. I think sanitation also is very, very important. Toilets.
Right.
All that really matters. Yeah. And that's often been really neglected in the water and sanitation debate. shit matters, I think. You have to take it seriously.
Because you're always encouraging me, Jeff, to simplify things for policymakers, I would perhaps hazard a guess, and I may be forced to regret this, that in most of the places where I see water problems, the short answer to where you put your money is demand management. Certainly, I'll put that on the table. That might be a point of contention, but certainly thinking, you know, in China, Yellow River, it's demand management in a lot of cases.
I would like to ask a question about the Nile, and also following what you said, there is in the delta of the Nile some disaster that is going to happen if, and I think when a global climate change, as a result of global climate change, in fact, the delta of the Nile has been taken as an example of the worst place where this is going to have an impact. A very large part of the land, which is one of the most fertile land for Egypt, is going to be under the water. Already, I've seen it recently. There is a road that was along the delta that is underwater. And of course, this is the most populated area in the country and the most productive agriculturally. So, and already the lakes that were, the lagoons that were on the border of the Nile are already all affected. So this is on one side for Egypt. On the other side, I understand, and this is my question to you, that the equatorial countries on the south are getting together to claim more right on the water of the Nile. As you know, they just cannot have access to the water of the Nile because there is this international convention that forbids these countries to build dams, for instance, for irrigation. Ethiopia cannot use its water to cultivate some of the regions which are very fertile because you need to take these regions away from the Nile. They have to build a dam, and they are forbidden by international law to do that. And so there is a movement from some of the countries in the south of the Nile to really get together and claim and really put very high pressure to get more water from the Nile. This means Egypt today has less water than what its basic needs because of population growth, industrial development, agriculture, etc. So where is this discussion going within the Nile Basin initiative?
I live in St. Petersburg in Russia, and it's a well-known fact that the quality of drinking water in St. Petersburg is very bad and dangerous for health. Some Russian specialists think that the very high level of cancer in St. Petersburg is closely connected with the bad and dangerous quality of drinking water. Many protests of environmental NGO in St. Petersburg is addressed to authorities and connected especially in this problem. Do you have these similar examples in your countries?
And I'd just like to take the question on the movement of the upper riparians to claim more waters of the Nile. And I think that's really the impetus for the development of the Nile Basin Initiative, because for the longest time, the countries that did not have access to the waters of the Nile, and that's all countries except Sudan and Egypt, really wanted to have a share of the waters of the Nile. If you look at newspaper articles, many countries were saying they were just going to go against international law and tap the waters of the Nile. But I think what has happened with the Nile Basin Initiative, and because there is now a concerted effort to revise the agreements that are seen as inequitable, countries are actually looking to what comes out of that arrangement. And I think I mentioned this earlier, that it is still not agreed whether what the agreement will bring about is recognizing the prior appropriation rights of Egypt, or whether it will go to give all the countries equal access to the waters of the Nile. And I think that's really where it's at. I keep hearing, even until last week, that we are very close to coming to an agreement, but we haven't seen any final document yet. I know there's a Nile Waters agreement, but it hasn't yet been ratified by the governments. And I think that's really going to stem the kind of movement by the upper riparian countries, depending on what the outcome of that agreement is.
Yeah, on St. Pete, I think that's countries all over the world experience that, and lots of countries you can't really drink water from the tap anymore. So the bottled industry has arisen to spare us from the risk. Even though very often bottled water may have more risks, there's been studies on that in the UK, and definitely in India and in many cities the water is undrinkable. We have Hans here who works on Madras, Chennai. He can talk to you about the problems in the city on water quality and how that undermines human security and health. On demand management, yeah, sure. I mean, I think it works. It can work, and it definitely is a clear solution in many cases. The problem arises when you introduce pricing mechanisms that can then overly tax the poor, which is invariably what happens in most parts of the world. So you end up poor subsidizing the water of the rich, and the rich. So in some ways, the tariff structures are very skewed. And then you also have water rights being promoted, or water reallocation being promoted as solutions, and they can also lead. I mean, they're good in some ways. People can get permits, can get access to water, but a lot of the socio-political and institutional processes are often neglected, and there can be exclusions that take place also.
I'm good. Well, thank you both, or all three of you, for excellent presentations. Thank you for some very good questions. I will urge you to visit two websites to keep in touch with these issues, these scholars and others in the network. One is the Wilson Centers and the Environmental Change and Security Project, where you'll be able to direct people to a write-up and a video and links and the PowerPoints from this presentation and others like it. And the other is the GECHS website, which is just GECHS.org, where you will find bios and materials and related research on from these folks as well as the others that you see around the room. So please join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you all very much.
Thank you. That's good.